The small car segment may be shrinking, but the situation isn't quite as dire as it may seem. It's still responsible for a huge percentage of sales each year, proving that not everyone is crazy for crossovers. But for those that need a little bit more practicality from their compact, there's no better way to go than a hatchback. And it's with that in mind that we've brought together the 5-door versions of the Mazda 3 and Honda Civic for a little head-to-head battle to see which is best. It's hard to believe that it's been so long since Honda last sold a hatchback version of the Honda Civic. You know, it was about 15 years ago, and the biggest difference between that car and this one is the addition of the 2 rear doors. This is a 5-door, whereas the last one sold here was a 3-door. And if you want to find the last 5-door Civic sold in North America, you'd have to go back to the late 80s. Honda's taken quite a bit of flack about the design since this 10th generation Civic was introduced, but personally, I like it. I think it's kind of refreshing. So many cars today look the same. They have that sort of jelly bean shape to them. This thing's really edgy and it's different. It stands out, and for that, I think Honda deserves a little bit of praise. Compared to the sedan, everything from the B-pillar back has been replaced, and it gives this thing a sort of coupe-like silhouette. It also ends up being about 4.5 inches shorter than the sedan overall. It's also got shorter overhangs front and rear, which means the wheels have been pushed closer to the corners. It gives it a little bit of a more aggressive stance, and it also helps cornering performance. This Civic hatchback is more than 4 inches shorter than its sedan sibling, but there's a ton of room inside for your stuff, and that's especially true about the cargo area. There's over 25 cubic feet of space back here, which puts this Civic near the top of the segment and way above the Mazda 3. But the coolest part of this cargo area is the privacy cover. Now, I know that's something that you normally don't get too excited about, but trust me, it is a really neat feature. It can be operated one-handed and from either side of the vehicle. How it works, when you need to hide some stuff if you're out shopping, stretch it across, click it into place, you're good to go. When you don't need it, simply slide it back across, but the coolest part is it stays out of the way. Privacy covers that run across the cargo area, they're really big and clunky, and when you try to fold the back seats down, they're usually in the way. You can't get a bigger item in there, you have to take it out. It's a whole big mess. It also runs the risk of you leaving it in the garage until you realize you need it and it's not there. This thing stays out of the way, and it's nice and small and compact and easy to switch from side to side. I really think Honda's got a winner on its hands with this privacy cover. Heading over to the Mazda 3, it doesn't take much deduction to realize that there is a lot less space back here. There's barely more than 20 cubic feet, which puts it near the bottom of the segment. With the seats folded, there's more than 47 cubic feet of space in the Mazda, which puts it at the top of the segment, and it's more than what's on offer in the Civic. But best of all, the seats do fold pretty well perfectly flat, which means getting larger items inside isn't a problem. The one downside is the Mazda does have one of those stupid flimsy cargo covers that we were talking about, and it definitely loses a few points to the Civic when it comes to hiding your stuff. When it comes to output, the Civic ditches the base engine in favor of the 1.5-liter turbocharged 4-cylinder across the entire trim range. And you know what? It's a pretty impressive engine. Output varies a little bit depending on which transmission you go with, but there's plenty of power on tap. There's also very little turbo lag to speak of. The full breadth of torque comes into play at about 1800 RPM, which means you don't really notice any of that stopping and waiting until power is ready. It also delivers a pretty impressive punch for a tiny engine like this. Keep in mind that this isn't a turbocharged engine predicated on power, it's all about efficiency, but it does a pretty nice job of giving you that little bit of pep when you need it. When it comes to the transmissions offered in the Civic, I'm not a fan of either of them. Our tester features the available 6-speed manual, and I know you guys are gonna go crazy and say, nobody buys a manual, why are you featuring a manual? It's not so much about the transmission in this review, it's more so about the car as a whole. I will say though, the clutch in this thing is just really vague and the shifter is really light. It's just not a very good 6-speed. It's easy to learn on, but there's not a whole lot of communication going on between your left foot, your right hand, and what's going on with the engine. I think it's pretty weak, to be perfectly honest with you. But the same thing can be said about the CVT. It's just not very good. It suffers from that rubber banding effect that's so typical of these transmissions, and it makes it seem like power's coming from some kind of pissed off sewing machine when you put your foot into it. I just think that if Honda is going to stick with continuously variable transmissions as its automatic option, it could do a little bit better to refine them and make them feel a little bit more natural, or as natural as a piece of mechanical equipment can feel. The Honda Civic has been caught up in the turbocharging trend, but Mazda has decided to stick to its naturally aspirated guns when it comes to this Mazda 3. It's available with the choice of 2-liter or 2.5-liter engines under the hood, with the larger of the two making more power, as to be expected. Both of these engines can be mated to the choice of manual or automatic transmissions, both of which use 6 gears to get the job done. Now, regardless of the engine-transmission combo, the 3 features Mazda's Skyactiv Voodoo technology. Truthfully, it's a whole lot of marketing jargon, but what it's meant to boil down to is better performance and better efficiency. One thing I can tell you it's not better than is burning less gas than the Civic. Whether you're talking about the manual or the automatic, the 2-liter or the 2.5-liter, this thing burns more gas than the Honda. The Mazda gets a combined 31 mpg with the 2-liter engine under the hood and 30 mpg with the 2.5-liter. When you're talking about the Honda, it gets 34 mpg combined with the CVT and 33 miles per gallon combined with the manual transmission. Clearly, it's better. It's not that much better, but it is something of note, especially when you're talking about commuter cars. If you're looking to save on gas, the Honda's the way to do it. And that's not just on paper. In real world testing, the Civic has consistently proved to be the better engine on gas. As for the way it drives, the Mazda 3 clearly comes out on top. It features a multi-link suspension setup with new dampers at all 4 corners, as well as a really tight chassis that errs on the sporty side while also doing a nice job to smooth road imperfections. It also features a nicely weighted steering setup that communicates corners pretty well, and it lets you know what the car is going to do. It also features even better cornering response for 2017 with the addition of Mazda's G-vectoring control system. Now, what that system does compared to a more traditional brake-based torque vectoring system like the one found in the Civic is it uses a little bit of electronic trickery to adjust engine speed when you're entering a corner, and it does that in response to steering input. It helps improve cornering performance, but it also helps reduce steering chatter. As you can see, I can let my hands off the wheel and it stays on center when you want it to, but it also doesn't mean it's any less communicative. It's a really well executed system. Not to heap all the praise on the Mazda 3, this Civic is no slouch either. Its suspension does a really nice job of smoothing uneven surfaces, but it also offers a little bit of that tightness you want when you're out to have some fun behind the wheel. The steering isn't quite as dialed in as the setup in the Mazda 3, but it's pretty impressive overall. It also features a brake-based torque vectoring system that helps improve cornering performance by braking the inside rear wheel to tighten things up and to cut down on that understeer that's so typical of front-wheel drive cars. You know, on its own, this Civic seems pretty sporty, but compared to the Mazda 3, it's kind of sloppy. It's just not as fun to drive. It's not as engaging. The steering isn't as communicative. And that's why it's so important to test drive more than one car when you're in the market for a new one. Even if you're dead set on one specific model, it's important to drive a competitor to reinforce strengths, but more importantly, to pinpoint weaknesses. You're the one who's going to have to live with this car for the foreseeable future, and it's very, very important to make sure it's something you can live with. When it comes to their interiors, both of these cars have pretty good things going on. Now, I personally prefer the look of the Mazda 3's cabin, but there's nothing inherently wrong with the Civics either. It's got a pretty nice look to it, and it also has some pretty key features like an available 7-inch touchscreen infotainment system that has Apple CarPlay and Android Auto compatibility. It's pretty easy to use. It's got really nice and simple steering wheel controls. No, it doesn't have a volume knob yet, but we'll let that one slide. Some of the materials in this car do feel pretty cheap though, especially in lower grade models. It just doesn't do the Civic any favors, but for the price, it's a pretty decent package. Like the rest of Honda's lineup, this Civic Hatchback is available with the Honda Sensing suite of safety features, and it's a pretty robust one. It features things like lane keep assist, forward collision warning, adaptive cruise control, you name it. It's a pretty impressive package for the price and just adds to that value proposition that this Civic brings to the table. As I said before, I just like the Mazda 3's cabin layout a little bit nicer than the Civics. I also think the materials in higher grade trims just feel a little bit nicer. The leather's a bit of a better quality. Some of the other materials used on the dash are also a little nicer. This thing also features a touchscreen infotainment system that's about the same size as the Hondas, but it's one of those free-floating types that sits on top of the dashboard. It also can't be operated as a touchscreen when you're moving, which means you have to use this control knob on the center console. It is a little finicky, but once you get used to it, it's not such a big deal. There's also little that separates these two when it comes to the front of the cabin. As you can see, there's plenty of room for me to fit. Even with this optional sunroof, there's still a decent amount of headroom. There's also tons of shoulder space. I don't feel cramped in here, and the same thing goes for the Civic. Like I said, there's very little to separate the two. Now, when you get into the second row, the Civic does have the slight edge, but there's more than enough room to accommodate a young family of 4. If you're part of a carpool group, it may not be ideal for the Mazda 3 to be your vehicle of choice, but there's still enough room to transport 4 adults on shorter trips without feeling too cramped. You know, there's a reason the Honda Civic and Mazda 3 have proven themselves to be 2 of our favorite compact cars on the market. Both are practical and fun, but won't break the bank doing either. If it weren't for the crucially important factors of infotainment and interior space, the Mazda 3 would have swept this comparison hands down. From base trim to top of the line, it's just the better car overall and is a lot better to drive. And when it comes to commuter-friendly compacts, that's what it all boils down to.